Hello, welcome to Chapter 6 on Genetics, Evolution, and Personality. We've made a great deal of ad- scientific advance in the study of personality from the perspective of biological levels. It is very important for us to always keep in mind that we are physical beings. We are biological beings. If I take a shovel and whap you upside of the head and damage the physical structure of your brain, then your personality, your behavior will change. You will be a different person. So who we are is that physical structure. So we have to understand the physical structure. We have to understand ultimately its operation because ultimately that is us. There's been a great deal of scientific advance, technical advance, and it has allowed us to study living brains, to measure activity at different regions of the brain, along with elements in terms of looking at genetic factors, the Human Genome Project, all of those sorts of things, which really allowed us to make a huge amount of advances in this area. Um, it's really taken us inside the black box. We can find out about human behavior without just asking people. We can actually look at what's going on inside of the brain. With all of that said, that isn't to say that any of this is simple, and we have to recognize that what you learned about genetics back in K through 12 was a gross oversimplification. The idea of you have dominant genes and recessive genes, and so if you have a dominant characteristic, for one thing and from one parent, and the recessive for the other, then then you have the dominant characteristic, of the other one's recessive, and that's it. You have a gene for being tall, and from your mother you get gene for being short, and well, guess what? Because you're the one that's dominant, you're going to be tall, and so forth. You know, and, that's what they teach us at K through 12. Usually because the science teacher used to be an English major, but all the English major jobs were filled, and so yeah, I took a couple of science courses, and so they tossed them in there. U.S. Science education sucks. So we end up in that kind of situation where you're being taught some very simple, basic things, which generally are in largely, like I said, gross oversimplifications. Um, and things are much more involved in that, much more complex. That creates a great deal of problems when people then take that simple explanation, dominant recessive characteristics, and hear somebody talk about something. Researchers say that they have found a genetic component to some behavior. There is a genetic relationship in terms of different personality characteristics. There's a genetic component to political beliefs. There's a genetic component to a variety of psychological disorders. There's a genetic component to criminal activity. Um, so quite often what folks hear, because their understanding of genes is, if you have this gene, you have this characteristic, is this idea that we could then go through to a population and identify those who have this particular gene, who are going to commit crimes, and just lock them all away, and then we'll be done with it. And behavioral genetics is a much more complex thing than that. Any given behavior, any given characteristic is influenced by many multiples of genes, and in different pairs or relationships patterns amongst those particular genes. And so you simply can't go and find one gene and link it up to one specific behavior. You're finding a gene that seems to be related to a large, in amongst a whole bunch of other genes, as far as one given behavior or characteristic. So understand it's much more complex than this. But we do understand that there is a genetic characteristic to basic elements of our personality. This idea of children at birth, in the womb, and then immediately at birth are different. Their fundamental behavior is different at birth. So what this is referred to as temperament. So you can see that talked about here on the slide as activity level, sociability, and emotionality. They are different. We are different at birth. So these characteristics So we can see immediately at birth here, we can see characteristics that we would later describe as personality traits. Um, and there's tons of evidence, as it says here, for heritability for a broad range of those traits, as I mentioned before, as well as connection to the five-factor model. You can see the temperaments just talked about, how they would link up to the five factors of personality in that particular way. Lots of different elements here in terms, and the chapter certainly spends a great deal of time talking about how genetics, as it says, work through personality to affect these particular characteristics. Um, in those particular elements. One thing to talk about here as we deal with this idea of genetics, it is important to understand that genetics and environment are not separate things, that genetics influences certainly our behavior, environment influences our behavior, but genetics also influences the environments that we experience, and environment influences genetics. Um, so one of the things that you will be doing for this chapter is viewing some videos talking about epigenetics, which talk about how different genetic characteristics are activated or turned on by different environmental influences. We also know that there are particular genetic characteristics that will influence the type of environments that you are exposed to. I'll use one that's less controversial from a genetic factor influencing environmental exposure, and use something like gender, which maybe is something that you don't necessarily think about as one of those genetic factors, but obviously that has a pretty large genetic component there. Um, and boys and girls, growing up as children, you are treated very, very differently by people and exposed to very different environments because of that genetic factor, that genetic characteristic. And then, there's lots of obvious ways that things are different, but just the idea of, say, the young boy that, hey, mom, dad, can I go to the next block and play with, with Bobby over there at that house. I'm gonna walk around to the next block and go and play. We're gonna play, some kind of game over in his front yard and stuff. Sure, little girl says that. The little girl has to do exactly the same thing at the same age. The tendency, you individually may be different, but overall, if we look at a population, parents are much more likely to be concerned about the little girl walking over to the next street by herself. I don't really want you to do that. Tell you what, why don't you stay here and help me around the house? So the little boy is much more likely to have opportunities to be exposed to environmental influences, the experience of, I'm going to independently navigate to the next block and independently engage in this activity and then independently return. Whereas the little girl's in a situation where, here, no, that's a little too risky for you. I need you to stay here with me. So the little girl doesn't get that exposure of the independence of going out to that other thing, as well as learning about how the environment might be a dangerous place for her. So we see both genetic factors, as you hear in the videos about epigenetics, environmental factors influencing genetics, and then genetics influencing environmental factors. So it's really important to understand that this is a very complex issue that we're dealing with here, and to look at this idea of different levels, as particularly in terms of what is, and look deeply into this in the textbook as far as the idea of non-shared environmental influences. We are an evolved species. Our genetics influences our behavior, and we evolved to be in the form that we are today. So many of our characteristics that we all share as humans are characteristics that helped us to survive, and reproduce. So our social behaviors, as it says, exist because they confer and some kind of adaptive advantage. Be this the situation where you're in class and everything is quiet, and somebody, drops a pencil and everybody turns to look. We are biologically prepared, evolutionarily prepared, to pay attention to changing stimuli, So that random noise, that sudden sound, we all turn and pay attention to it because evolutionarily speaking, if we didn't, then we were likely to get eaten by, a saber-toothed tiger. Thus, our genetic information would not get passed on to the next generation. So we all are the descendants of proto-humans that responded to those changing stimuli. That's why we do that. Likewise, we love the taste of fat because evolutionarily speaking, the taste of fat, eating fat allowed folks to put on lots of extra body weight and stuff. So when at times of great hunger, starvation, and we were able to survive. Those that didn't like fat and always just ate just a little bit and stayed nice and lean, they all died because they starved to death and were not able to pass on their genetic information. Evolutionarily speaking, it's not so adaptive now to like the taste of fat. Tough. Historically, food was scarce. Now it isn't. It's a problem for us now. And of course, the textbook here obviously using the example of altruism, so I'll let it do that to explain. There's not much else that I can do there with it, but it's important to understand that our behavior is evolutionarily adaptive. Those characteristics that carry us forth. Excuse me. And we can see in terms of genetic similarity theory here, I don't think I'm deciding I'll let the textbook probably talk about that. Genetic factors here that shape us, and indeed in terms of mate selection and competition, variety of characteristics. In terms of gender differences, this is a key one here because evolutionary psychology or sociobiology has a great deal to say in regards to sex differences here. And it has to do with the fact that for women, as it says, greater investment in offspring, generate fewer offspring, choosier in mate selection. One has to look that for a woman to have an offspring, there is a huge risk at health and loss of life, especially in the pre hospital days. So we're going back to times before there's, back when we're still grunting and crawling around, those sorts of things. So there's a great deal of investment in offspring as far as a great risk for women. If you're going to have offspring, then you're going to also have limited fighting capabilities, limited food gathering capabilities for 9 months or so, plus the feeding the child afterwards and so forth. So it's a great deal of risk. And really a dependence on some assistance from either a group or other members of your particular individual or other members in your particular group after the child is born. So for women, it's a big investment. Need to be really choosy in mate selection. For males, on the other hand, generating offspring requires very, very little risk. In terms of the initial mating, as long as everybody's in agreement and nobody's trying. There's certainly the competition for mates, but otherwise there's very little risk. Takes hardly any time, and you can generate lots of offspring without any kind of consequences there. And so there's really no reason for males to be particularly selective in that process. So, excuse me. In terms of what that starts to work out to is in terms of different things that males and females are attracted to, and different behaviors that you will see. There's the example that I always use and talk about in class is if a woman goes into a bar and walks in and says, "Hey, I'm a lonely woman and I want to go home and have sex with somebody tonight. Who's interested?" She will leave with you know, at least one, likely more, and certainly find many males who are interested in, yes, let that person be me. On the other hand, if a male goes into a bar and does exactly the same thing, hey, I don't want to be lonely, I want to go home with a woman tonight, who's with it? The odds are that it's not going to have the same result at all. And indeed, so the sociobiology perspective argues that's a reflection of the the different degrees of investment in offspring from females and males. Excuse me. Um, Males tend to be attracted to signs of fertility, youth, fitness, and beauty. Those are things that heavily attract males to females. Females tend to be attracted to males who have status characteristics, elements of wealth and power, and those sorts of things. Um, the 50 Shades of Grey stuff, lousy book, equally bad movie, I'm told. Not read, not seen either of these things, but it's certainly the case that the woman is a virginal 20-year-old, and the male he's a real wealthy entrepreneur kind of situation. Plays very much into exactly the types of sort of the ideal kinds of situations from that perspective. Um, we also see research on this in terms of different kinds of responses in terms of jealousy, the kinds of things that create jealousy. For males, research is talked about in the textbook. Males are particularly concerned about issues of paternity. For females, concerned about issues of family support. So jealousy then addresses that loss of support or emotional bonds. For women, for males, much more concerned about sexual infidelity. One of the things about offspring for women, no matter what, the woman knows that's their kid. The man, on the other hand, only has the woman's word for it. One of those basic biological facts. You know that's your kid if you're a woman. If you're a man, well, they tell me it's mine, but I don't really know. Um, you never see on the Maury Povich whenever he's doing the DNA test and that sort of thing. It's never the woman going, "That's not my kid." That never happens. It's always the guy. So it's that basic issue there. So again, our behavior driven in those particular ways, trying to maximize those mating strategies. Again, just tons of examples of how our behavior is shaped and our personality is shaped by our evolutionary history. Um, One of the issues, and I won't go into the young male syndrome, let the textbook talk about that, but this particular kind of pattern of behavior, the idea here is really one of the fact that evolutionary behavior, um, evolutionary driven behaviors don't necessarily adapt well with cultural changes, cultural evolution. And I get to where I'm looking for here. So cultural evolution happens really fast. So lots of things change really quick in terms of our environment. Biological evolution, on the other hand, is very, very slow. So I made mention earlier of the idea of our biologically we've evolved to like the taste of fat. Cultural evolution has happened very, very quickly, where all of a sudden we went from very little food being available to us to no shortage of high-fat foods all around us, very easily made available. Creates a great deal of problem for us. Um, Likewise, our evolutionary pattern of behaviors, this competition for mates, the so-called young male syndrome that they're talking about here, those sorts of activities or behaviors are ones which have been evolutionarily advantageous for us in years past, but because of the way that our culture has changed so quickly, and not so. In turn of from the 19th to the 20th century, the majority of Americans were living on farms, for example. The turn of the 20th to the 21st, the majority or overwhelming majority living in cities or urban environments, or suburban environments. So very few people living on farms. So all of this stuff has happened so quickly. Weaponry has advanced at a rapid pace. So in the past, where we might be trying to fight one another with our hands, now we can simply grab a gun and shoot somebody from a great distance away. So lots of problems that have come across there in terms of the fact that cultural evolution happens very quickly, biological evolution very slowly. So our what were adaptive behaviors for us, not so much anymore. Um, which of course that means that it's going to be really difficult for us to address some of our problems. To leave you in that sad, depressing standpoint, I'm afraid is where I have to leave you.